Good evening and welcome to this our weekly Wednesday night book study here at the New Covenant House. We are, if you've been with us before, you know that we're reading Christian Anarchism by Alexandre Christoyannopoulos, who wrote it as his doctoral thesis. And we have now for 4 weeks been talking about what the anarchist writers have to say about the state. And tonight we're going to wrap that up with a section called The State as Idolatry. Idolatry is the idea that you replace God with something else, something more that's more important than God, and put your faith in that, whatever that is. And we'll see that Christians, not only Christians, but everybody pretty much have replaced God with the state. And there's a lot to say about this. I have literally highlighted every other line in this section. But I'm not going to read all of it, I don't think. But there's very important stuff. But it does say the same thing a couple of times in different words. So it begins with the statement that the state is a human creation which dethrones God and his laws. If you remember back, we talked about in 1 Samuel chapter 8 how Samuel got a message from the people that they wanted a king. And Samuel went to God, and God said that no, this is not a great idea, it's going to be terrible. And of course it was terrible. They ended up with Saul, David and Solomon and a bunch of other guys who were even worse. So there was one place where he said that Samuel was concerned that they were rejecting God's answer, but God tells Samuel that they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. So that is a significant time that the Israelites relied on idolatry. And there were other times, for example, Aaron's golden calf and such. But this is one of the important things, because this is where the first time they really had a government. They got a government that was not of God. Before that, all government has kind of like been a flat there was no real government, but they relied on judges. That there was people who stepped up when there were a crisis in the nation. They were not really rulers like Saul became. So Pentecost, we've heard about him before, notes that to rely on legislators, judges, and policemen implies that we have a God who made a lot of laws which are so defective that the universe would go to smash if it were not for these honorables and bigwigs and blue coat and brass buttons with all their authority and clubs. So the idea that if we didn't have government, the world would go under because the people simply don't trust that God can take care of them. So it says, to rely on human laws and law enforcement suggests both a lack of faith in God's laws and providence and an arrogant confidence in humanity's capacity for self-government. So this self-reliance is bad. The state embodies the sinful human desire to sit in God's throne. So in other words, people want to replace God and take his place. And Goddard, I don't remember him before, but we had definitely we have seen before, says that the state has become a new locus of the sacred in our society. So in other words, they were pretty much repeating here that in people's mind, the state has replaced God, and they put all their faith in the state instead of in God. It is the state that is held responsible for all that occurs, and to which people now look for security, protection, and solution for all their problems. Another evidence that people are replacing God with the state. The state in turn thrives upon this religious devotion, encourages it, and demands its citizens' full compliance with all its decisions. People have faith in the state, obey it, and impute to it the attributes and powers of God. So, another way of saying that they're replacing God with the state. Evidence that the state really is demonic is because, I don't know if you remember, Jesus started his ministry by spending 40 days in the wilderness, and he was tempted three times by Satan. And one of them, the last one, I believe the last one, was that you can rule the world. All you have to do is bow down and worship me. And that is evidence that the state really is a demonic institution. It is evil and it is demonic, and you avoid it at all costs because it replaces God. And then the next paragraph here, in Acts, Peter says clearly that we ought to obey God rather than men. Ballou writes about that. He says there's on one hand human government, and then there is the divine government on the other hand. And the two cannot be combined. They are simply incompatible, because you cannot serve two masters. You cannot serve God and the state at the same time. It's impossible. And the oath of allegiance to human government is the direct negation of Christianity. So the state, pledging allegiance to the state, is the opposite of Christianity. You deny God. Selznicki, he's the 15th century writer. That means before the Reformation. He's very important in this context because he really is before everybody else. He's kind of like the origin of all this. And people don't know that today. He says, he who obeys God needs no other authority because, as Paul says, love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. So, in other words, we don't really need human laws when we have God's laws. And I think it looks like we're going to get into that more in chapter 4. So we're going to be in this book for a while. So we're not going to mention anything else about that here. The point for Christian Anarchists is that true Christians would not elevate the state to the status of God, which we just heard that they are doing. Ultimately, one can place one's trust and have faith either in God's law of love or in the coercive and human state, not in both, like Ballou has already mentioned. Hence, Christian Anarchists speak against the state, such a center of power and violence, being given a Christian name and justification. So, the state is given the attributes of God and even given the Christian name and justification, so meaning that the state is God for these people. For them, there is a fundamental contradiction between the state and the gospel. One is by nature violent and coercive, the other teaches love and forgiveness. And therefore the term Christian state is a contradiction in terms. It's impossible. So Tolstoy is the one who writes about this contradiction in terms. He's wondering that he has the welcome. We're just going to finish up in a few minutes, and then we'll turn off the recording, and we'll go to discussion. So he's wondering that the sermon that teachers will talk about the Sermon on the Mount on Sunday school, and then the next day the kids will be subscribed to serve in the army. So that's a contradiction right there. Tolstoy repeatedly insists that the state and Christianity are completely incompatible. We just saw that before. In sum, for Christian anarchists like Tolstoy, the state is a violent, deceptive, and exploitative human creation. To follow it is to deify it. We saw that before already, that people have attributed godly attributes to the state. They rely on it for their protection and everything they need in the world. One can either place the Christian God above the state and thus follow Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, or the state above God and thus follow human laws. We have so this is pretty much the end of our study of the state. And next week we're going to start talking about the church doctrine in support of the state. So the church actually supports this idea that the state can replace God. And there's going to be 3 weeks about that. First of all, we're going to talk about the Sermon on the Mount. And then the second week we'll specifically dive into the idea of non-resistance, and then finally we will go into how the church supports the political authority of the state. So that's all I have tonight, and we're now going to turn off the recording. So we have a guest tonight, and we will discuss what we just read. And I'll see you next week. Thank you for coming.